You are listening to the Airline Selection Podcast, where we bring you insights to help you succeed at airline selections. This podcast is brought to you by Airline Selection Program. Please welcome your host, airline captain and major airline recruiter, Guillaume Debauchez.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of the Airline Selection Podcast with our guest, Calvin Shields. Calvin, how are you doing today?
Hi, Guillaume. Yeah, great. Thanks. And thank you very much for inviting me to continue this series.
Good. So we left it when we were still in Hamburg, when you finished ground school, right? And so in this episode, we're going to talk about what happened when you were flying and the differences between flying then and flying today in flight school.
Okay, Guillaume. Well, perhaps it's a good idea to talk about Hamburg itself. It was known as the College of Air Training, and effectively it was a cadet school for BEA and BOAC, the precursors of British Airways. Now, Hamburg was a former RAF and Royal Naval Air Squadron airfield, which is just to the east of Southampton and just to the north of the Isle of Wight. When the Isle of Wight is a rather, well, for English standards, quite a large island just off the south coast. That's where we did all of our general flying, which was quite useful because we had a lot of pointers geographically to help us navigate back to the airfield. Now, Hamburg was the grass airfield. It had, if I remember rightly, 3 different runways. But as I said before, it was pretty easy to navigate to, but it was pretty basic at the same time. No paved surfaces. We did have an ADF hut in the middle of the airfield that we could navigate towards, but otherwise it was just a grass strip, effectively. As far as the flying was concerned, the flying was very similar to the sort of courses that ATOs offer today. We had 3 aircraft. We had the de Havilland Chipmunk DC-1, which is a single-engine aeroplane with about 100 horsepower, if I remember rightly. It was a tandem aircraft, so your instructor sat in the back and you sat in the front. We did our general flying on that aircraft. Then after that, we did basic instrument flying with the Piper 28 Cherokee. And then we finished off with the Beechcraft BE-55 Twin Baron.
So sorry for interrupting, but you only had an ADF on site. You didn't have did ILSs exist then?
No, gosh, no. No, they were state of the art in those days. What we've got to remember is we're looking at, for me, when I started in 1968, I finished in 1969. Effectively, we flew everywhere on needles, of course. You know, it was generally NDBs. There was no VOR nearby. So yes, we only had an ADF in the middle of the airfield. It was a hut, literally, in the middle of the airfield that transmitted the signal. So on the Chipmunk, we did about 50 hours, which was basically learning to fly, I guess. We did circuit work at Hamburg, and then we flew over to the Isle of Wight to do, I guess you would call it, sort of general handling. But what was interesting was that every single day we weren't doing circuits. We would be required to practice 2 aerobatic maneuvers that were linked together. So by the time we'd done our 50-odd hours, we were pretty used to having an aeroplane upside down. And of course, we did full stalls, full spins, and of course, as I've already said, that we would be quite comfortable at flying the aeroplane upside down. It was a semi-aerobatic aircraft, the Chipmunk. You couldn't fly upside down for very long, but it was quite a fun aeroplane to fly. And that was probably the best time for me at Hamburg. My instructor was a really super guy, and we had quite a lot of fun flying the aeroplane because when we finished our exercises, he would throw it around and we would just generally have good fun. And I can remember my first solo with great affection when it took me, if I remember rightly, 7 hours to go solo. And I can remember, as I'm sure we all do when we've gone on our first solo, I wasn't expecting it. We taxied to the control tower. He got out. He was a Welsh guy, and he said something like, "Don't bend it, boyo," walked off towards the tower and left me to it. And there you go. Your first solo, you never forget. And I can remember looking round downwind, the seat behind me was empty. It was a seminal moment, I suppose, one that we never forget. Then after that, what was really quite nice about Hamble was that they trusted us. I can't think why. They trusted us to be able to fly solo at the weekends when there weren't any instructors around. And so, of course, we did have a bit of fun. We'd all meet up, particularly after a few beers, perhaps the night before in the local pub. And we would do little dog fights, chasing clouds, chasing each other totally. I guess it wasn't approved by any means, but we did have a lot of fun. It was also very good for team building because we made friends. We bonded together by having our little groups and flying together at the same time.
Flying going on then? I mean, there wasn't too much traffic?
Well, yes, that's a very good question, Guillaume. In those days, of course, there wasn't very much traffic. But what you've got to realize is that there were 4 courses, 48 pilots going through Hamble every year. So that's effectively nearly 200 pilots. Of those 200, only 100 would be flying. The other 100 would probably be doing ground school and so on. So at a weekend, I'm guessing here, but I'm sure there was upwards of 30 or 40 people, but we flew dual when on the weekend. So that would be 20 airplanes. I don't think we even had 20, come to think of it. It must have been maybe all of the chipmunks would be up there over the Isle of Wight. And it was fun. And that was the end of the fun at Hamble because it became very serious after that, because then we started the business of basic instrument flying, which we did on the Cherokee.
Okay. So, but there was no general aviation flying as we know today. There wouldn't be like the odd person flying at the weekend that could cross your path. You were kind of alone. The students were alone in this airspace. That's what I mean, right?
Yes, absolutely. There was very little. There were on the Isle of Wight, you had Sandown, you had Bembridge, and there was one other one. I can't remember what it was. So Bembridge, they used to make the Britain Island Norman, what was it called? The Islander there. Britain Norman Islander, that was it. Sandown was a general aviation airfield, which was another grass strip. And quite often it had sheep on the runway. And the air traffic controller, we spoke to her regularly when we were flying over there. And we all sort of imagined at 18 or 19 that she was a gorgeous girl. And of course, we always used to contact her when we were flying over. But her job mainly was to chase the sheep off the runway so that we could come. We did touch and goes there at Sandown. And so we'd call her in and she'd go out and chase the sheep off the runway. We'd do a touch and go and off we went. So that was carefree. That was fun. Don't forget that we'd done the best part of 9 months, was it, of theoretical instruction. We talked about that in the previous episode. Very, very similar pressures, similar pass marks. Quite a few people failed at that hurdle and sadly were thrown out of the school. So by the time we got to the chipmunks, it was really probably the best time of all at the college.
For those who are watching who are perhaps younger than the both of us, this seems like incredible freedom that you don't have it today. You can't go to a flight school now and go like, well, I'll just go and take an airplane and just do whatever I want at the weekend. This doesn't happen.
Well, the thing is, we needed to obviously have the hours. I think if I remember rightly, we needed 250 hours. So if we had finished, so first of all, you would do your circuit work, you would do your general handling, spin stalls and so on. And then you had general test 1, which was normally, it had to be completed before 50 hours. If you finished it and passed it at 40 hours, you had to make up those 10 hours. And so what they decided is we were getting behind because of the weather, of course, in the UK was never predictable. We would lose days during the week. And so they would say, okay, you can fly at the weekend. There's no instructors flying. There'll be a duty instructor on call, but we would then just team up and make our hours up. 2 pilots in an aeroplane doing a couple of hours was 2 hours each. So, of course, we'd passed the first stage. And so we just didn't have to do anything apart from make the hours up.
I guess that's the same today, right? In fact, they have to go and do some hours building. And I guess today at flight schools, they have to roster it a bit more carefully because the usage of the airplanes, I guess, is tighter.
I think you're right. But the thing that surprises me is that I work at a local ATO. I do theory and I also teach the MCC in an A320 simulator. So I am aware of the flying program at the ATO. But I'm also told that they are, for example, when they get to the twins, they're definitely not allowed to go solo in the twins. But we certainly did, because when we got to the Baron, we had exactly the same issue, really, because I managed to pass my instrument rating on the Baron quite early and I had to make up the hours. So I went single in the Baron at night on a cross country after I'd got my instrument rating. And I must say that I did actually circle my old school, which I didn't like very much, perhaps at a lower level than I should have done, but I'm not saying that for sure. Revving the engine up and down just to upset the school below. That sort of thing was incredible. And what we used to do, of course, is that we'd tune in Radio Luxembourg, which was a very popular pirate radio station at the time on the radio, and blast it away. And I think I had 10 or 12 or 15 hours or something that I could just do whatever I wanted. And that was fun too, without any instructors around. Again, at the weekends, we didn't do it at the weekends, but we had to make up night flying and daylight cross-country flying to make up the hours. Yes, so that was fun.
And so the radio, you tuned it on an ADF? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, it was 210. And was it 210? I think it was 210, or Radio Caroline it was called, or Radio Luxembourg was the other one, yeah. And actually, I must tell you a little story whilst we're on that one, whilst we're talking about the Barons. Well, I'll go back a little bit. The Piper Cherokee was the basic instrument flying, and my instructor, as I think I mentioned last time, was a very, very strange Yorkshireman who used to hit me over the head with the QRH. And I refused to fly with him on the Barons, and they gave me, and again, I mentioned him last time, he's absolutely marvelous character, Tony Leskutin. A Polish guy, absolutely brilliant guy. One day he said to us, because we flew in pairs, just like they do at ATOs today, me and my buddy, he said, okay, we're going to do a cross country. We're going to go to Luxembourg, and we're going to go to Radio Luxembourg, because I know the people in Radio Luxembourg. Of course, he didn't. We spent the night. We flew to Luxembourg, landed there, and we got into a taxi and drove up. It was in a castle, drove up to Radio Luxembourg. And he was so full of bluster and he was such a confident man that he talked his way into Radio Luxembourg, where one of the very prominent DJs was playing. And when the red light went out, he introduced us to this DJ who we had no idea who he was. And it was the most extraordinary thing. And we had great fun on that with him. But the time I spent on the DA42, there you go, I'm slipping. On the PA-28 on the Cherokee was really tough.
In what way?
Well, because we didn't do any real general flying. It was all instrument rating under the hood. And as I said, with this particularly unpleasant man who would physically, hit me with the checklist. So on one occasion, we were flying along the south coast, and where was it? We went anyway. He suddenly said, I'm fed up with you, Shields. He said, land, and I forget where it was. There's an island on the south coast there, an airfield on the south coast. We landed, and I can remember quite clearly, it was raining a little bit. He said, right, get out. On the grass near the terminal, he just said, near the control tower, he said, get out. And I got out, and the other guy, because we were flying in pairs, he got into the seat, and he left me there. He flew off. And, he was saying, you're so useless, you can't fly, get out. I don't want you on the airplane.
That was after landing. He got you off the plane without going back to the airplane.
Yeah, he said, land. And I'm just trying to remember the name. It was near Brighton, the airfield. And we landed, and I taxied to the control tower. And he said, right, you're so useless. Actually, he used a lot stronger language. He said, right, get out.
So you were not even at your home base. He left you.
No. This was about 50 miles from Hamble.
But how did you get back?
I got out because I was quite scared of him. I was, I guess, 18 or so. And, he was a very, very aggressive man. My fellow pilot in the back seat, he got in the front seat. They took off, and I'm standing there in the rain, not knowing what was happening. So I went to the control tower and waited around a bit. An hour later, he came back and picked me up. How about that for good training CRM?
Wow, yeah, that's fantastic. Wow, I'm so sorry to hear that. And one thing I wanted to ask, so you were flying instruments, and just to set it back, I think it's useful for our audience and for me to understand the state of the technology as we're going to go through this series. I'm going to add my little feed here. Airplanes didn't change that much from that time until when I did my training. I did on the Cessna 152, 172. And on Robin DR400s, which technology-wise, I guess, apart from having a VOR needle, which is, or an ILS, I guess, when you did instruments, were probably not very different. It changed a lot after I finished with GPSs just being introduced and the airplanes that we have now, with maps and even, TCAS and being able to do RNAV. That's a big technology jump. Between you and I, there wasn't that much, those sort of 20, 30 years of, yep. So what was the technology available, though, in terms of equipment? ADFs, you said there were VORs, but not that many. Were there ILSs already? Did you do SRA? Was there SRA? What was available?
Yeah, it's funny. So these are all words I haven't heard for years. Yes, we certainly did SRAs. Like even when I joined British Airways, or BOAC as it was, we practiced SRAs from time to time. There was even an SRA at Heathrow.
I did an SRA once at Heathrow, once with a former Air Force pilot who told me it was possible, and he asked for it for practice. It was very impressive. Would you mind explaining our audience what it is? Because I'm sure 98% of them won't know.
Well, it's short for a surveillance radar approach. And quite simply, it's something that the Royal Air Force and I guess air forces throughout the world use quite a bit. And effectively, you're controlled by a radar, and he tells you what heading to fly. You have to fly the heading, and then he'll give you a suggested glide path. You should be at such and such height and so on. And you literally follow the instructions. You're the autopilot for a man on the ground who's controlling you effectively via radar. And imagine doing that into a major airfield. But it was certainly at flying college at Hamble. It was something that we practiced. I think we did it at Bournemouth regularly, if I remember rightly. But as far as the navigation was concerned, in the aeroplane, we did have VOR. And in the Cherokee, I'm pretty sure we didn't have the ILS. But what we navigated on quite simply was NDBs and VORs. And our cross countries were without GPS or anything like that. We literally had to follow the needles. Of course, unless you were VMC, then you did real proper map reading, looking at the ground and plotting it on a topographical map.
Yeah, all of this is very similar to the way I was trained, actually, with the map and the watch and with the heading. And by literally Absolutely. 1 or 2 or 3 seconds, you expect to be exactly where you are at the set time if you keep your heading properly. But to go back on this technology, sorry, I'm coming back to this because I find this fascinating. I just want to say for the SRA, what's amazing, if I remember right, is that the minimums that you could do on an SRA were almost the same as an ILS, I think. Maybe yes. I'm wrong.
I think it was 300 feet, I think.
300 feet. That's right. And you could still see it on the charts, actually, in my days at least. And this is incredible. So just to say this very, very precise radar that was available in your early days of your early training, and that was still available. I don't know if it's still available today, but it goes as far down almost as an ILS. So the controller can track you really precisely, and he gives you not just the azimuth, it gives you also your sort of descent path. That's just incredible.
He'll say, okay, turn right 5 degrees, you're 50 feet high.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
And wow. He'd even say, check your gear down as well.
That reminds me of flying in Pakistan, actually.
Yeah, they're a bit behind times with I think with the terminology in Pakistan. Yeah, of course, at Hamble, we, of course, didn't have magenta lines. We didn't have flat screens. So everything was based on needles. Absolutely everything. ILS, of course, is perhaps not needles, but you had to follow the ILS. No flight director as such at Hamble. But as far as the rest of the training, you talk about technology. We also had to sit a Morse code exam. We had to learn Morse code.
Yes.
And we had an exam, and if you failed it, then you had a chance of failing the whole course.
Yeah, my captains at BA when I joined, so I joined BA in 2005, my captains, they all knew the Morse code.
Yeah, I still do.
They must have been trained in the 90s, and they all knew the Morse code.
I was just thinking my surname is ... How about that?
Impressive. I don't know what to say. ...
The other thing that was very different in those days compared with today was that we had no MCC. The simulators we had the Link D4. If you visit an aviation museum, you might be unfortunate enough to see one of these torture machines. It was a box driven by pneumatics. A big compressor filled up this bladder or this balloon underneath it, and it responded to your control stick movements. But on top of that, there was a pantograph, which is like a contraption that plots your flight on a big chart where the instructor would actually sit and give you instructions over the headphones, and he would follow you with a plot on his chart. That was pretty tough. Most people remember the Link D4 with not much affection.
I see. And so what sort of procedures could you work with the Link D4?
It was nearly always exclusively NDB letdowns and flying basically radials on NDB needles, not on VORs. That's what it was.
But so again, on the equipment you had, sorry, I'm coming back on this for the third time, but you had NDBs, you had one at your airfield, you had VORs for cross country. So there were a few VORs, probably still the ones that we have today, the big ones, at least the long range VORs. And then you had DMEs. Did DMEs exist?
Yes, they did. Yeah. Not all VORs had DMEs in those days either.
And were there ILSs at Heathrow and places like that? Did they already exist?
Yes, at Heathrow and at Bournemouth, there were ILSs, but we were only really there on the major airfields. Yeah. Also, there was no such thing as GPS, of course, so we didn't have RMP approaches or anything.
So they were radar controlled onto an ILS most of the time?
Well, yeah, you say that actually quite often it was a procedural ILS. So
that's what I was wondering. Were they doing procedural and then even at Heathrow, they were doing that?
No, not at Heathrow. Well, we didn't fly to Heathrow. We flew to Gatwick. And they weren't procedural there, but if you went to Bournemouth or Exeter where they might have an ILS, it was basically a procedural. You fly overhead the beacon, do the procedure turn, join the ILS and come in and land, something like that.
It was in those days there, the way it is today, still in some countries that have less means, like, if you go to Dhaka in Bangladesh, for instance, you still do that. You fly overhead and you do your procedure. So that's how it was then in the UK, in like a long time ago now. Good. And one more question then, how would you fly the approaches you would fly back into Hamburg? So there were ADF approaches, but if you didn't have a DME, so when would you know to start your descent? How was that done?
Well, when we flew into Hamburg, I'm trying to remember what the limits were, but it was quite high. I think it was a visual approach because don't forget, we did most of our Chipmunk flying and the Cherokee flying was at Hamburg, but the twins, when we could fly in much more restricting conditions, we would effectively fly to Gatwick or Bournemouth where they did have proper equipment. So the approach to Hamburg was effectively a visual approach. You would use the NDB to establish an radial and descend to a very high, I'm guessing 1,000 feet. I can't honestly remember.
Good, because you couldn't do an arc even if you don't have the distance. You can't do an arc. So you were very limited. You could only home to Hamburg and hope to see it then, I guess.
Well, we would go overhead the NDB and do an NDB letdown effectively, but to very high limits. But we didn't do that on the Chipmunk because we don't think we even had an NDB on the Chipmunk, but on the Cherokee we could, yes.
So for those watching who don't know what is a letdown?
Okay, so what a letdown is that you have on a chart, you have a track which is drawn using positions on the ground as reference points at which we might arrive overhead the beacon in the middle of Hamburg, and then you had to track out on a particular track or heading, and then you could descend using a stopwatch, descend to a certain height, and then you would follow a procedure to turn towards either another beacon or towards a heading, which might bring you back. It might be a sort of reverse so that you come right back to the beacon, descending to a height at which you should see the airfield, which was a safe height. There was no terrain around, and I'm guessing it was about 1,000 feet. So effectively, you would fly out on a bearing. You would turn around for a certain time. You would turn around and fly in on another bearing towards the NDB, and you'd come in and land. By 1,000 feet, hopefully, you'd be able to see the airfield.
Excellent. I mean, I don't think I've flown something like this myself, although the aircraft I was flying during training had an ADF and we used it quite a lot. So that's fascinating. So this takes us to sort of the end of your flying, or do we still have a few more stories and crunchy bits to give to our audience?
Well, as I said earlier, one of the things which, having started talking to you about this, there were, as I say, at any one time, an awful lot of aeroplanes flying around in the circuit at Hamburg. There were some incidents where there was a couple of collisions throughout the 10-year period of Hamburg, I think. I'm not sure how many. I think people were killed, but I can't remember. But the one thing that I would like to tell you a little story. I did mention that we had this wonderful freedom on the Chipmunk on a Saturday, and particularly perhaps after a few too many beers in the pub the night before or a curry, we'd go out and we would enact Second World War pilots doing dogfights in very underpowered machines. Well, with my buddy in the front one day, we were flying. They'd done a whole sequence of rather pathetic aerobatics, I guess you'd say. And then, of course, I'm afraid I felt rather ill. And we always took a sick bag of hospital with us just in this eventuality. And I must say, I'm afraid to say I did throw up in the aeroplane. I think we were upside down at the time, if I remember rightly. Anyway, and of course we thought, well, what do we do with this bag? So we decided to do a low fly pass of Sandown, where we had this vision of this beautiful girl sunbathing. This was in the summer, sunbathing by the tower. And I did slide the canopy back and I tried to bomb her with the sick bag. And I had this sort of rather childish image in my mind of this sick bag lying next to her and bursting on the ground.
That's an interesting seduction technique, Calvin. Have you tried other similar ones?
Well, plenty, but we were schoolboys, or I was 18 at the time. This was a schoolboy prank. But it was fun.
Okay, well, excellent.
Oh, there is one other thing I must tell you, which will make you laugh. At the very end of it all, bearing in mind there were an awful lot of people going through Hamble, and we had the actual commandant was an ex-air vice marshal. And at the end of it all, we had a ball, and once we'd all graduated, and I think a third of my course failed, sadly, but we had a ball, everyone was invited, and at the end, then the next day, we were given our wings, if you like. And and when I was presented with my wings, the administrator the boss did not know my name, didn't even know who I was.
Oh, well, that's good. Well, when I was at BA, some captain told me, my goal is to never meet a manager in my whole career. So far, so good, I was like, aren't you interested in what's going on and, getting involved maybe one day in something, some projects? Say, no, if they don't know my name by the day I retire, I think I would have had a pretty good career. Okay, that's one. But a lot of people agree because it's true. And for me, having been in recruitment, I know that a lot of people who actually make it to the office, usually it may not be for pleasant reasons. They call it, you get invited for tea and biscuits. And if you're invited for tea, no biscuits, it means it's not good. And no tea, no biscuits, it's really not good at all, So,
and if you were invited to attend in uniform, it was even worse.
Ah, okay. Well, at Emirates, you didn't have the choice. I think at BA, you could come to the office for a meeting without the uniform, indeed. Yeah. Yes, indeed. If you were just coming to talk casually, yes, you could, indeed. Yeah.
Well, there was one captain who was a real character. He used to fly Shackletons, I think, in the RAF, and he was well known as being different, put it that way. I forget what he did. He did some misdemeanor, and he was called in to the chief pilot. And when you're in uniform, and he walked in the door into the office, and he said, you can either tell me off or sack me. He said, I don't want both.
Very good. Very good. Well, thank you, Calvin. I think we'll close this episode here. And I'm going to think through whether we do an episode on dating techniques as well, and how you improved on that throughout time, which I know for having read your book that you did. But anyway, it was a pleasure to have you on this episode. And again, we're here to bring you valuable insights, colorful stories, and information and techniques for you to learn more about aviation in general and things that you can bring into your selection as well. As part of your culture, as part of your airmanship, and listening to Calvin, surely you will pick up a lot of good insights. And with that, I'll close the episode and I'll say goodbye and see you on the next one.
This podcast was brought to you by Airline Selection Program, a company that is focused on helping you succeed at airline selections. Our flagship course, Advanced Interview Course, has helped hundreds of pilots just like you become successful. Visit our website at online.airlineselectionprogram.com and find out how you too can get the job of your dreams.